Welcome everyone. Thank you for your attention. My name is Jennifer Balint and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging where we are, that we're meeting tonight on the unceded lands on which we work, learn and live at this university. For our university campuses as a whole, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples, the Bunurong peoples, the Yorta Yorta Nation and the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of these unceded lands. Our university also acknowledges and is deeply grateful to all traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who've been instrumental in what we do together in reparations, reconciliation and justice. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of these lands and waterways across this Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. And we acknowledge these extraordinarily important enduring cultural practices of caring for country. As a university, we pay respect, and I pay respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledges in this academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are very privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues, students and partners. In making this acknowledgement of country here at this university, we commit to respectful and responsible conduct towards all others according to the traditional laws of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. I offer my personal welcome to you, Nour Haydar. It's a deep honour to have you here with us tonight. And before I introduce our guest speaker, Nour Haydar, let me say a few words about the A.N. Smith Lecture Series here at the University of Melbourne. The A.N. Smith Lecture Series is one of the University of Melbourne's oldest continuing public lecture series. This series commemorates one of the founding journalists who worked in the press gallery of the Australian Parliament, as well as helping to found and lead the Australian Journalists Association, Mr. Arthur Norman Smith. With thanks to a generous bequest from the Smith family, this lecture has been given regularly at the University of Melbourne since 1938. The A.N. Smith Lecture enables a platform for important voices from across the media landscape in Australia and internationally. It makes a strong contribution to robust and intelligent discussion and conversation about issues confronting journalism and the public role of journalists. This lecture series is also a sign of the university's support for a vibrant and diverse media landscape in Australia. And we are delighted to welcome Nour Haydar as this year's A.N. Smith Lecturer. Nour Haydar is co-host and senior producer of Guardian Australia's daily news podcast, Full Story. Prior to joining Guardian Australia in 2024, Nour was a federal political reporter with ABC News at Parliament House in Canberra and a fill-in presenter on ABC News Breakfast. Nour is continually committed to storytelling and to a journalistic practice that holds the powerful to account. Nour's lecture tonight will address the topic, reflecting on Palestine, Australian media and who gets to shape the story. She will highlight the responsibilities of the newsroom in times of conflict, whose stories are told and from which perspective. She will reflect on in what ways can workplaces better engage with the people who are directly affected by violence. How can organisations empower journalists to report with rigour and authenticity on events that they have unique and valuable insight into? What do terms like credibility, objectivity and impartiality mean in the modern and diverse newsroom? Our university community is representative, importantly, of a diverse range of perspectives, and I want to take a moment to reflect again on our acknowledgement and the importance of knowledge sharing, the importance of personal histories and lived experience, and of respectful engagement. We are deeply grateful to our invited speaker who has come here tonight to share with us her reflections on this important topic. Most importantly now, please make welcome our A.N. Smith Lecturer for 2024, Nour Haydar.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wiradjuri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal people here tonight. Thank you to the University of Melbourne and the Centre for Advancing Journalism for inviting me to deliver this year's A.N. Smith Lecture. As it is the oldest journalism lecture series in the country, I feel an immense privilege, but also pressure to be at the podium this evening and to be delivering a speech focused on Palestine, the Australian media, and who gets to shape the story. In the months since accepting to deliver this lecture, and as I attempted to write and articulate my thoughts, the story has continued to shift beneath our feet. Last week, the United Nations Special Committee found that Israel's warfare in Gaza is consistent with the characteristics of genocide, adding its heft to the long list of scholars, legal academics, governments, human rights defenders, doctors, and not to mention Palestinians themselves who've described Israel's actions this way. The number of Palestinians killed has surpassed 43,000, according to figures from Palestinian authorities, and could be as high as 180,000, according to some public health officials, public health experts. With the overwhelming number of those women and children. A report published just last week on World Children's Day estimates that these figures include at least 935 children with the name Muhammad, 439 with the name Ahmad, and 110 with my name Nour. The situation in northern Gaza is now apocalyptic, according to UN officials, and the Famine Review Committee has confirmed that famine is taking hold. Tragically, and of most relevance to our work as journalists, at least 129 of our peers, journalists and media workers, documenting the deliberate destruction of their home and homeland, have been killed over the past 400 days, plus 6 in Lebanon. I've had to update that number numerous times as I've drafted this lecture. The assault on media staff and institutions extends beyond Gaza. Israeli forces have raided and shut down Al Jazeera's bureau in Ramallah, and they have also placed sanctions on Israeli newspaper Haaretz for publishing articles which hurt Israel. Last month, we all saw images of 19-year-old engineering student Sha'ban ad-Dallou, who was burnt alive while attached to an IV drip when an Israeli strike hit Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. The Israeli Knesset recently moved to ban UNRWA, an organisation established to support Palestinian refugees who were expelled or fled from their homes in 1948, before Israel was created. In September, Israel simultaneously detonated thousands of bombs across Lebanon, engaging in what experts describe as extrajudicial killings by booby-trapping pages and radios used by members of Hezbollah, wounding thousands and killing children and hospital workers, despite legal experts saying that these attacks were a violation of humanitarian law. Some media organisations ran headlines glorifying them. This was then followed by a ground invasion, which has reportedly flattened entire villages in the south of Lebanon, killed thousands, and displaced more than 1 million people, including members of my family who've been displaced multiple times and have lost their homes. Israeli ministers have openly declared their desire to annex the West Bank, and soon there'll be a US ambassador who seems inclined to support them in that mission. The United States' so-called ultimatum on Israel to boost aid to northern Gaza has come and gone with no effect or consequence. I could go on. All of this in the last 3 months alone. All of these stories are deserving of leading places in our bulletins and on our websites, deserving of interrogation and follow-up. deserving of political attention and analysis. But as the months have rolled on, these stories barely seem to make a ripple. In some cases, I had to go digging in the world section to find any mention of them. If you only consume Australian news, you may have missed the story of Gaza surgeon Adnan al-Barrouch, who was taken from Al-Auda hospital by Israeli soldiers and detained for a period of 4 to 5 months before news of his death emerged. Eyewitnesses say he had been tortured and sexually assaulted to death. Or maybe you missed the story of Zionist settler leader by the name of Daniela Weiss, who says she recently entered northern Gaza to scout locations for future Israeli settlements, with reportedly 740 families already expressing interest. Then there's the story of Israeli authorities refusing the medical evacuation of Al Jazeera camera operator Fadi al-Wahidi, who was shot at Jabalia refugee camp and who, like many others, requires urgent medical care. All of these stories are outrageous and newsworthy, but who gets to shape the story? If your news diet is only made up of Australian news, you are only receiving a sliver of the picture, one that is filtered, written, curated and commissioned, in many instances by people who have never been to the Middle East, who have a limited or little understanding of its cultures and religions, and whose knowledge base on Israel and Palestine is largely derived from other Western news sources and outlets. It's a feedback loop, one that provides little opportunity for Western journalists to identify and examine their own bias. The last 13 months have been seismic for our industry. There have been many who have publicly and loudly expressed their distrust and even their disdain towards traditional media organisations because of the way that we have covered the horrors taking place in Gaza. The long-term consequences of this cannot be overstated. At a time where trust in traditional news and organisations and other institutions is in decline, we have contributed to the acceleration of audiences turning their backs on us. We cannot blame people for doing this when they see on social media and alternative news media sources providing on-the-ground stories that are much more detailed, informed, and human than what we have been offering. As Western media outlets descended into debate about the credibility of the death toll in Gaza and whether to ascribe the figures to the Hamas-controlled health ministry or simply the health ministry, people watched on their phones day after day as body after body was pulled from the rubble, as children wept for their dead parents and parents for their dead children, as fathers collected the flesh of their children off dusty floors. Scenes that traditional outlets have failed to fully capture, images that will outlive many of the words that have been printed, and memories that will be passed on from one generation to the other long after we retire from our jobs. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, about the dehumanisation of Palestinian people, about the physical and psychological harms caused over the last 13 months, and how the media has failed to meet the moment. I've also been reflecting on my experiences in Australian newsrooms and my own family's story, trying to unpick how it is that we got to this point. What are the systemic, organisational and cultural problems that have left many journalists, myself included, re-evaluating our place in newsrooms and in this industry, feeling a sense of guilt and complicity when many of us pursued journalism because we thought it to be a noble career. I have a complex, uncomfortable and love-hate relationship with the media. It has been present in two of the most profound and personal moments of my life. In July 2006, I was 13 years old. I was a high school student in Sydney's southwest, and my family had been gripped to the TV for days. Lebanon was at war with Israel, and the small village where my parents and ancestors come from, Aitarun, had been under heavy attack by Israeli forces. My grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins were still living there, and fearing for the lives of our extended family, we tuned in to satellite news night after night. One evening, I heard the piercing scream of my mother from the living room. My grandmother's name had been read out by a reporter in a list of people killed in an Israeli drone strike. The drones had hit a convoy of vehicles fleeing the south while flying white flags as a desperate sign to the drones and aircrafts above that they were civilians. My uncle Hussam gave evidence to Human Rights Watch in a statement that was later published in a report titled Why They Died, explaining what happened during that attack. He told field investigators that the convoy they were in was on its way to Sur when they were followed and bombed by drones. The first 2 cars in the convoy were hit. My family in the third got out of their car and ran to nearby fruit orchards on foot. Then came another strike, and then another. My grandmother was hit. According to my uncle's statement, she lost her arm, her leg, and died 10 minutes later. Her death was brutal, cruel, and deliberate. The IDF has never given an explanation for why it targeted this convoy, despite the fact that they had marked themselves as civilians and despite the fact that they were following evacuation leaflets that had been dropped on the south in the days prior. Within the period of 1 month, Israel had bombed civilian infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, 20 publishing houses and research institutes, and media organisations. Israeli officials openly declared that they would wind the clock back on Lebanon 20 years. A fact-finding mission by UN experts said that serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law had been committed by Israel. It was found that Israel showed reckless indifference to the fate of Lebanese civilians. Israel's well-worn claim that Hezbollah used civilians as human shields was not borne out by the evidence. Investigations, which involved interviews, site inspections, and graveyard visits, found that there was, quote, nothing to suggest that this was a widespread practice. Israel was condemned by human rights groups for treating civilians who stayed in their homes as combatants. In Australia, my grandmother's death made the news, and my mum spoke bravely to the media about her loss and her grief. However, as my sister Anani points out in her memoir, The Mother Wound, the news reports engaged with our sadness, but not with the politics of why civilians are able to be killed in their own homes. This frustrating lack of analysis persists to the present day. Despite the parallels between Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza today, our reporting has failed to reference the well-documented practices of the Israeli military, like the so-called Dahi doctrine, a strategy to deliberately cause disproportionate death, damage and destruction. The media has also continued to uncritically report unsubstantiated Israeli claims that Palestinian combatants are using civilians as human shields. We have failed to draw on the immense body of knowledge that could help inform our reporting and fact-check more rigorously. We could and should have done better. The experience of losing my grandmother in such a violent way and the subsequent lack of accountability for her killing was formative. It taught me invaluable lessons that I would carry with me as a journalist, lessons that I would put at the centre of my work. It taught me that justice and accountability for victims of war crimes committed by powerful states is rarely, if ever, achieved. It also gave me insight into the Middle East beyond what you may come across in Australian news reports. And that is the type of knowledge and expertise that newsrooms should take advantage of rather than hold suspicion towards or even infantilise. It's given me a fuller understanding of the history of the region, of Israel's impunity, and the on-the-ground impact of Western foreign policy in the Middle East. Losing my grandmother in this way brought to my attention the claims and the myths used by Israeli authorities and their allies to justify its actions, to gain sympathy, and to prolong attacks. Because of my background, Because of this detailed and direct lived experience, I have a knowledge base and insight that helps inform my journalism, helps inform the questions that I ask, the experts that I speak to, and the contacts that I bring will inevitably differ to those of my white peers. That experience gives me, and many others like me, a healthy scepticism towards Israeli military claims, which some journalists seem too willing to report with little context or interrogation. It is simple. A beat reporter, for example, on health or the NDIS, with in-depth knowledge of their round, is more likely to produce a better story than a general reporter assigned that story at late notice, or a court reporter who is more likely to understand the legalese and knows what documents to look for and how to access them. Diversity and inclusion efforts over the past decade have resulted in more Arabs and Muslims working in newsrooms. Much of the reporting that has humanised Palestinians has been to their credit. The dehumanisation of Arabs was something that I saw play out in Western media and politics throughout my schooling years. There was fearmongering after 9/11, and journalists amplified the US government's false claims of weapons of mass destruction before the US-led invasion of Iraq. These events were a driving force in my desire to pursue journalism. I believed strongly in the capacity of good storytelling to educate us about our world, to bridge divides, to shed light on injustice and to keep the powerful in check. I believed that our presence, that diversity in newsrooms, would be the antidote to poor, sensationalist, inhumane and stereotypical reporting on Arabs and Muslims. For too long, the conversation about cultural diversity in newsrooms has been overly simplistic. It's been reduced to phrases like, "you can't be what you can't see." After the release of the ABC's racism review earlier this year, which found systemic racism within the national broadcaster, Stan Grant said that deep structural cultural issues cannot be solved by simply putting more diverse faces on air. He said that the ABC cannot hire itself free from racism, and that editorially it requires a shift to supporting and valuing lived experience and cultural knowledge. Stan Grant is right. Without these crucial perspectives, relevant knowledge and histories remain missing from our reporting on Israel and Palestine, and indeed Australia's Indigenous history. How many of you, for example, would know that Lebanon was occupied up until the year 2000? How many would recognise the names of villages like Kana and Khiem, where significant events have taken place? There are parallels between the experience of people from the south of Lebanon and the experience of Palestinians, a shared history of occupation. Similar war crimes have been committed against Lebanese people, and they are familiar with Israeli military tactics. People with lived experience have a deeper and more nuanced understanding of how political events and policies affect their lives. Newsrooms risk alienating and losing staff of diverse cultural backgrounds if they are not proactively consulted and involved in shaping coverage of issues relating to race and racism. Journalists of colour can contribute more than a contact book or a translation service. Now, many of the lessons that I learned from losing my grandmother would stay dormant until I finished my high school years and moved to university. While I was at uni, I lost another family member to another form of violence. In 2015, only months before I graduated from journalism, my mother, Nour Haydar, was murdered by my father. Her death was brutal, cruel and deliberate. As I sat in the cafe area of a Sydney hospital, waiting for an update on my sister's condition who was injured in the attack, my mother's Facebook photo stared back up at me from the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. An ABC headline on my phone read, "Tragedy hits family again as war victim's daughter Nour Haydar stabbed to death in Bexley." Journalists found the story of my grandmother's death and for no clear journalistic purpose, connected the two events. Perhaps it was out of convenience, because my mother's photo was already on file from 2006, or perhaps it was to sensationalise and differentiate this case from the other 30 cases of femicide that year. That headline, with its almost superstitious undertone, unwittingly prompted me to consider the role and responsibility of media when reporting on violence. It's also made me reflect on the parallels and differences in the conversations around coverage of domestic violence and state-inflicted violence. Let me explain what I mean by this. In Australia, over the last decade, there has been a reckoning when it comes to media discourse around sexual, domestic and family violence. There's been a push by many feminist and anti-domestic violence groups to overhaul the way that journalists speak about domestic violence, what causes it and how we might stop it. There is a widely championed, albeit less widely adopted view that journalists have a responsibility to report on domestic violence in a way that does not further traumatise victims and reinforce violent attitudes. A couple of years after my mother was murdered, I was part of a cohort of journalists who were selected to participate in a fellowship program run by the primary prevention organisation Our Watch. This program was designed to equip us with an understanding of the best practice reporting principles. And I seized this opportunity because I felt strongly and passionately about reporting on violence against women. But as a relatively green journalist at the time, I wanted to understand the theory and the literature around gender-based violence. I was also worried. I was worried that my lived experience of losing my mum to domestic violence would be used by some to dismiss or disregard my reporting in an environment where activism journalism gets a bad rap, or where journalists who report passionately on gender and race are derided. I was worried that my colleagues would assume that I would carry a bias because of my experience of violence that would then get in the way of fair, accurate and balanced reporting. Generally, these worries did not materialise. Instead, my experience was seen as a valuable contribution. It's also, since then, become widely accepted that victim survivors can play an important part in developing effective political and legal responses to domestic violence. In recognition of this, best practice reporting on domestic violence encourages reporters to centre the voices of those with lived experience, name perpetrators and avoid passive language that absolves them of responsibility. Avoid language that blames the victim, like "she made me do it" or "I was provoked." Avoid euphemisms that obscure the gravity of the alleged crime. Consult with subject matter experts who can shed light on the statistics and explain the power dynamics at play in abusive relationships, and contextualise individual crimes in reference to the underlying drivers of violence. Since 2013, the Walkleys have handed out an Our Watch award to journalists whose work meets this criteria, in recognition of the fact that it produces fairer and more ethical stories. This movement has been based on evidence that indicates that there is a clear link between media reporting and social attitudes and beliefs in relation to violence against women. For example, the audience's emotional responses about who is responsible is affected by how media frames that news. Journalists can and should be applying a similar logic to racially motivated violence, which follows similar trajectories to gender-based violence, and particularly to our reporting on Israel and Palestine and other forms of state-inflicted violence. How often do you see headlines about a deadly strike killing civilians that fails to mention who was responsible, even when that is not a contested point? How often do you read an article that doesn't include a single Palestinian voice or maybe buries it? How often do we give platform to people who blame Palestinians for the violence inflicted upon them? How often do you read an entire article that omits any mention of illegal settlements, to the large body of evidence that Israel is maintaining a system of apartheid, and to Israel's illegal occupation. Embedding basic principles like those promoted by our Watch for domestic violence into our reporting on state-inflicted violence would only strengthen it. By consistently naming the perpetrator, by giving voice to those with lived experience, by resisting victim-blaming and dehumanising tropes, and ensuring accurate context is included, we can bolster the credibility of our work and safeguard it against propagandists who seek to use the media for their own military objectives, and also demand accountability from our own elected officials on decisions that have massive humanitarian consequences. Doing this would not get in the way of traditional journalistic principles of truth, fairness and accuracy, but rather it would enhance them and remedy some of the inherent imbalance between occupier and occupied, just as it does between abuser and abused. My grandmother's death was as violent and as unjustified as my mother's. Whilst I've been asked in my capacity as a journalist and presenter to share more of myself and my insights on domestic violence, that hasn't been the case when it comes to state-inflicted violence. Indeed, many journalists have been cautioned not to express any view on this issue, and their perspectives have been dismissed as mere opinion. My proximity to the subject matter of domestic violence was viewed as an asset, whereas my lived experience of Israeli violence has been viewed as a liability. Part of the problem is the way that objectivity is understood in our industry. As a journalism student, it's drilled into you that it's a core tenet of our work, but I don't think many stop to actually consider what that truly means, who arbitrates it, and whether it is achievable. In the Our Watch Fellowship, we discussed how objectivity doesn't sit inside the journalist, but rather it is a process that should be followed to gather and present information and data. Some journalists, media and race academics have observed that in practice, objectivity has been used to uphold the status quo and excludes voices from marginalised communities. In my years working in newsrooms, it was obvious to me who got the assumption of objectivity and who didn't. I recall in 2020, in the hours after Justice Paul Brereton released the findings of his war crimes inquiry, which found credible evidence that Australian soldiers had committed war crimes in Afghanistan, I was discussing with a colleague how to cover a statement issued by the former Prime Minister John Howard, the Prime Minister responsible for sending Australian troops to Afghanistan. Another senior colleague interjected from across the newsroom, saying something to the effect of, "Just report it straight, don't let your personal background get in the way." I can tell you that in newsrooms across the country, people of colour, irrespective of their cultural background, all have a similar story to this one. The ABC Racism Review also revealed that to be a common experience, and many have told me that it has been amplified over the last 13 months. Too often, conversations about objectivity ignore that the whole process of news gathering and news writing involves subjective choices and value judgments, from what stories we run, to what resources we allocate to them, to the lead sentence, to the headline, to the choice of words and the turns of phrase, to who gets quoted and in what order. Some journalists, including prominent Jewish Russian-American writer Masha Gessen, argues that moral clarity would be a much better guiding ideal of journalism than objectivity. African-American journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates expresses a similar view. In his book, The Message, he compares the subjugation of Black Americans in Jim Crow America to the treatment of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. He says that in his work he has no interest in defences of the patently immoral. He argues that US media has been deceptive in its framing of Israel and Palestine, including in its portrayal of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. He says that journalists claim to be hearing both sides, as though a binary opposition has been set down by some disinterested God, and says that it is journalists themselves who are playing God, as they decide which sides are legitimate and which are not, ultimately deciding which stories get told and which are not. I believe in following the weight of evidence, and I believe that objectivity is important, but so too is acknowledging its limitations. Nowhere are these limitations more pronounced than in the way that media and politicians speak and write about Israel and Palestine. Take, for example, in 2022, when Amnesty International released its report, which found that Israel enforces a system of oppression and domination against Palestinians that amounts to apartheid. The then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was asked about the report. Now, this was a 280-page long document. It followed the release of a similar report by Human Rights Watch, which made a similar finding, which built on findings by Palestinian civil society and human rights groups and Israeli organisations, which all found the same. The weight of evidence was increasingly clear. Scott Morrison, however, dismissed the report, only to say that no country is perfect and that Australia will remain a staunch friend of Israel's. His answer encapsulates the indifference of our political leaders, an indifference to the injustices, cruelty and humiliation that Palestinians have had to endure for decades. What would his response have been if the findings were about a state that was hostile to the West? Both the report and the Prime Minister's response came and went with little media attention. This is just one recent example of when the media and political leaders have glossed over inconvenient truths. This creates an environment in which events like October 7 appear to have arisen out of the blue, and where the public is ignorant of the long-standing human rights abuses that have existed. How many Australians would have known that before Hamas's attack on October 7, that 44 Palestinian children had already been killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank and Gaza that year, or that 45 Palestinian children had been killed the year before? How many would have known that the Israeli government had already approved the construction of 4,500 homes in illegal settlements on Palestinian land, or that Israel attempted to shut down 6 Palestinian civil society organisations documenting human rights breaches against Palestinian children, women and prisoners, or that Israeli authorities are currently holding more than 3,000 Palestinians in administrative detention without trial and without charge. It's disturbing how often stories about Israel and Palestine obscure or entirely ignore the history and minimise the violent nature of a military occupation. What's even more disturbing is how some media organisations willfully conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism to deliberately silence critics. This is not straight-down-the-line journalism. To understand the problems in the way that traditional media organisations have covered Gaza over the last year, it is instructive to look at what came before. An abrasive pro-Israel lobby has succeeded in muddying coverage. It's created an environment where journalists and editors don't pitch stories or shut down stories because of the potential backlash and headache they might bring. I've witnessed this. We've seen it reported in the case of Antoinette Lattouf, and John Lyons documented this pattern extensively in his essay Dateline Jerusalem, where he says that journalists and editors know that if you write anything critical of Israel or favourable towards the Palestinians, you open up not just a Pandora's box, but a seemingly depthless one. Over time, this has been corrosive and has led to self-censorship and timidity in newsrooms. This pattern of succumbing to the influence of a special interest group or groups whose stated purpose is to advocate for a foreign government completely undermines the integrity and independence of our newsrooms. As foreign journalists flooded into Israel last year, I couldn't help but reflect on how little coverage and how few stories reach Australian audiences from the Middle East outside of periods of unrest, violence and war. Just one Australian media organisation has a permanent presence in the Middle East. This creates a skewed perception of the region and of Arabs and Muslims, one that dehumanises them and creates a tolerance for their inhumane treatment. In addition to this, there is poor cultural and language literacy within newsrooms about Arab and Muslim diversity, the geographical and political landscapes of our homelands, and the complexity of our experiences. I was asked by one radio sub not that long ago to revoice a story where I pronounced Gaza as Arabic speakers would. I was told that for consistency I should say Gaza. I've been asked what constitutes the occupied Palestinian territories and whether people speak Arabic in Lebanon. Whilst the fast pace of newsrooms doesn't allow much time for sensitive reporting and thorough research, everyone has a responsibility to be informed when reporting on matters with huge humanitarian consequences, and that should take precedence over other pressures. While some Australian journalists have spent the past year writing hit pieces on those who they seek to silence, Israel has been silencing those bearing witness in Gaza. I mentioned at the beginning of my speech that at least 129 journalists and media workers had been killed in Gaza, with another 49 wounded. The Committee to Protect Journalists has confirmed that at least in 5 of these cases, the journalists were directly targeted by Israeli forces, in cases which it classifies as murders, and they are continuing to investigate other cases. Like many of you, I have worried that one day I would open my Instagram and not see an update from Bisan Alda, who has shared stories regularly from Gaza, beginning with "I'm still alive." She has kept working despite being displaced and suffering from swelling and ulcers on her feet due to the lack of medical equipment. I was brought to tears when I saw photographer Mu'taz Aziza help transport the limp and lifeless body of a Palestinian baby and then continue working. I was in awe of the resilience of Wa'il al-Dahduh, who continued to report after a number of his family members were killed, including his wife, son and daughter, while he was on air. We have come to know Palestinian reporters and photographers and others like Plestia, Anas, Hind and Mahmoud through their first names and by their first names. Their family, friends and colleagues have been killed, and yet they've persisted. With dwindling supplies, broken equipment, little internet, and the threat that they themselves could be next. Attacks on the press in Palestine are not new. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that prior to the 7th of October, Israel had never held its military accountable for 20 journalists' killings over 22 years, including Al Jazeera Arabic correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh. How is it that journalists will rightly express outrage about the arbitrary detention of Western journalists in China, Iran and Russia, and yet there has been no uproar about the killing of our colleagues in Gaza, or about Israel's ban on foreign reporters that has prevented international media organisations from reporting from the inside? In a recent interview, Gaza journalist Sharouk Al-Alia spoke about the killing of her husband, journalist Rushdie Sarraj, in an Israeli strike. And she made this plea to journalists. She said, "It's like we're down a well screaming and we only hear the echo. We need foreigners to come and report. Maybe they have something to say, maybe someone will believe them. But we are tired and exhausted, and we have done everything in our power to tell the story." As I read Sharouk's words, I'm saddened by the lack of solidarity shown by many of the journalists in this country for our Palestinian and Lebanese peers. Palestinian journalists have been left to tell the story of their own destruction, bearing witness to the most extreme acts of violence against their own community, as the world has questioned their credibility. This is not an attitude or an experience unique to Arab journalists. First Nations journalists have spoken about the similar prejudices that they face in newsrooms and more broadly. Journalist and academic Dr. Amy Maguire has written about this in Black Witness. She says the Black witness is often told they must be legitimised by the white witness. Journalists in Gaza have been smeared. They've faced threats. They've been accused of being terrorists, of being untrustworthy, because they are reporting on their own communities. By extension, the contribution, feedback and ideas of Arab journalists in Australia have also been seen as suspicious, biased or untrustworthy. Media apathy towards the injustices inflicted on the Palestinian people has helped lead us to this moment. If Australian journalists, along with media in the US and the UK and elsewhere, had valued Palestinian lives, had stood up to the Israeli lobby, perhaps we would not be where we are today. Had we scrutinised our own government's support for Israel as it maintained the world's longest military occupation, perhaps we could have averted this. Everyone in this room would agree that journalism and media can have a tremendous impact on the lives of people, on shaping public consciousness and politics. When such power is wielded irresponsibly, it can also fuel racism and justify the unjustifiable. Just last week, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for crimes against humanity and war crimes, including starvation, murder and persecution. For those who've been agitating for more balance and care in our coverage, this comes as a kind of vindication. These are some of the very war crimes that we were warned about and the realities our colleagues lost their lives trying to expose. Over the last year, as I weighed up the professional and personal risks associated with speaking about Palestine, I have found solace in the words of Caribbean-American poet June Jordan. In her 1984 essay, Life After Lebanon, she said, "As a child, I was taught that to tell the truth was often painful. As an adult, I have learnt that not to tell the truth is more painful, and that the fear of telling the truth is the most painful sensation of a moral life." Many in the West who have sought to speak the truth or have offered a perspective that challenges the status quo have been silenced, ostracised, demonised and maligned, irrespective of their profession or industry, from journalists to politicians to bakers to pianists. In journalism, it's exposed a double standard over what issues newsrooms consider to be controversial. Drawing attention to human rights abuses experienced by Palestinians is not controversial. Surely journalists can all agree on that. And if not, then it should be you that is shamed into silence. I am aware that by delivering this lecture this evening, I risk the same disingenuous backlash that others have faced. I know that there is a risk of bad faith attacks that will come from some parts of the Australian media and then be followed by racist and Islamophobic abuse online. I know there is a risk to my employment and career prospects. I know there is a risk that my words can be taken out of context, distorted, misreported and misrepresented by the usual suspects who seek to stifle any debate on Palestine. However, the fear of these risks seems to recede when I consider the risks our Palestinian colleagues in Gaza and Lebanon face and the sacrifices that they have made. I would like to end this evening with words of a Palestinian writer and feminist, Asma Abu Mazaid. She wrote in her 2022 anthology, along with other writers, called Light in Gaza, about why Palestinians hold onto their phones and keep recording. Her words were prophetic. She said, "We are always portrayed as terrorists, violent people, or as numbers, abstract and formless. We are repeatedly asked to prove our humanity, so media channels give us a few seconds of airtime. We hold onto our phones and leave the camera rolling, recording our tears, our screams at losing our fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers and children, our anguish, our attempts to run for our lives, our crippling fears, our powerlessness to calm our children when the house shakes with the deafening silence, through the deafening sound of death delivered by F-35 missiles sent with love from the US government." She said, "We record our plea for humanity's help to end this horror, which is more than our cameras can bear." Thank you.
Thank you very much for that incredible, compelling, powerful and beautiful speech.
Thank you, Andrew.
I think you've expressed it as well as it could possibly be expressed. That spontaneous show of emotion, I think, says a lot about the issue, but also about the media's coverage of it. So thank you for that as well. My name is Andrew Dodd. I'm the Director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism, and it is our great pleasure to host tonight's lecture. And Nour, you've really done it justice. I think what you've demonstrated tonight is the profound importance of these spaces to say things as important as you've just said. And I think you've demonstrated that this has been lacking in our debate and in our discourse. And tonight has been something of a corrective. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
The questions have been coming in, and my job is really to reflect the tenor of those questions and to put some of those questions to Nour. And a lot of them speak to the courage that you've demonstrated and to the humanity, but also to this litany of atrocities that you've outlined here this evening. And I think in some ways this question sums up some of that. It's a question that asks whether it's possible to be Arab and Middle Eastern and Australian, and how does one belong, have a sense of belonging after having our trauma denied from Australian leadership and media?
Yeah, that is a really powerful and profound question, and one that I don't think I can fully answer. That is a question that I'm still coming to terms with and trying to reconcile within myself. I think I know from a lot of my friends, extended family, peers, and people who also feel that the last 13 months have been just profoundly disturbing, that a lot of people, irrespective of what industry they're in or where they've dedicated themselves, are grappling with that question. I think it was also a question that ultimately prompted me to leave the ABC. I wanted to feel that I I didn't want to put, I guess, my personal and the big moral questions that many of Australians are now asking themselves behind. And I felt that to an extent I was having to do that. And I think it's about ensuring that, you be your authentic self, and we should be able to demand a place in this country as Australians of an Arab background. This is our country, and we should be able to expect more from our leaders and our institutions.
You mentioned the ABC. There is a question here about whether or not the ABC has shifted in its position, in its coverage of the conflict. Have you seen a shift over time? And I suppose more broadly in the media, has there been over the last 14 months a move in a direction that is showing more humanity towards Arabs in a Middle East perspective, or not?
I think if there has been, it is only a byproduct of how immense the suffering has become, not because the media has deliberately decided to change the way it tackles these stories, but as the evidence has become more and more, I guess, undeniable, that has inevitably been reflected in some of the coverage. However, I would say that I still very often turn on the news or read an article and I'm disturbed to see the second paragraph of an article being a statement from Netanyahu. And that's not to say that we can't report the statements of these officials, but we need to build context around them, and balance needs to be reflected in our work. And when you have dozens upon dozens of institutions, human rights experts, lawyers, doctors providing testimony and saying that something is not right, having the Israeli Prime Minister's denial as the second part, I think, skews that balance. And I think that it's been disturbing that some organisations have not realised that yet.
You talked about the danger you face in terms of people with bad faith in the media now representing what you've just said and the way you've said it and using it against you. And often it's the case in discussion of Israel and its complicity in this conflict that people need to give lots of qualifications before they're able to be critical of Israel. And the first of those qualifications is to say that what happened on October the 7th was wrong. Now, it's notable that tonight I don't think you did that, and that must have been a conscious decision. Can you talk us through your thinking about that?
I think it absolutely was a conscious decision. I think we have, over the last 13 months, had to bear witness to some incredible atrocities. The question itself is an insulting one. It is one that assumes that as Arabs we do not recognise that all humanity is equal. And so for me, I wanted to make a point that tonight, for 13 months, we have seen unbelievable amounts of violence. And that tonight was about my reflection on Palestine, was about my grandmother, and was about my experiences in newsrooms, which are valid and don't need to come with qualifications.
This question is about the craft of journalism and how to practice it in relation to this issue. New journalists report facing real challenges with some of the systemic issues you've talked about. What advice can you give to people in newsrooms who are trying to report on this issue?
I think, as I've mentioned in the speech, applying some basic principles that help address the inherent imbalance between a powerful state actor with the capacity to produce propaganda and share information at speed is really important. And I've talked about some of the ways that we can do that, about talking to those with lived experience, those who've experienced violence, about ensuring that we build context around the drivers of violence, which in that case would be, as many have said, an ongoing military occupation, the longest in the world. I think it's about slowing down. It's about identifying your own bias. Why are you inclined or not to view a particular person in a particular way? Why are you inclined to question the authenticity of their statement despite all the images that we've seen over the last 13 months? Why is it that you struggle to trust what that person is saying? And I think that if you follow many of those best practice reporting principles, which we already apply or should be applying to our work on domestic violence, and apply them to state-inflicted violence, that's a good start.
Can more be done in newsrooms to support reporters? Can more mentoring happen? Are there ways in which we can build some of these good practices into newsrooms?
Andrew, I tried to point out in my speech that I think some of the best reporting over the last 13 months has been done by Arab journalists in this country. People who carry an immense burden when they do that, because they know that they probably cannot do it right in the eyes of different groups. But they also are in direct contact with people in Gaza, have family and friends who are grieving and mourning, and have direct contact to communities that are at the heart of this. And I think that it is important that whilst we allow them to produce their individual stories, there needs to be some consideration about how they are involved in the broader discussion around how we frame these stories beyond just the single story that they produce. Because of course, as people turn away from news, and we know that this is the case, people don't really decipher or differentiate between opinion analysis reporting. If it comes out of an organisation, oftentimes that tars the entire organisation and indeed other journalists within that organisation. Now, I'm sure many might have seen just this morning the Washington Post editorial board said and took aim at the ICC for pursuing Benjamin Netanyahu and Balint. How are people to read the content that the Washington Post publishes without viewing it through that prism? And I think that that, for me, is important. We need to consider as a whole how we are writing about state-inflicted violence and not leave it up to an individual journalist with the expertise or the insight to make sure that they try as best as they can, although sometimes it is impossible to include some of that balance.
Particularly interesting given the Washington Post decided not to editorialise on the US election. Of course, for some journalists working in newsrooms, and I'm thinking here of former Fairfax, now 9 journalists, who signed letters showing some support for the Palestinian people, they were then necessarily barred from reporting on the issue. Now, I know there are two sides on this. There is the argument that says that as journalists you shouldn't be a player, but the downside of this is that people with some empathy for the cause have been less able to report on it. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I think you've summarised it perfectly, Andrew. I think if we just lifted our standards, there wouldn't be a need for journalists to sign those petitions.
This question, I think, reflects a lot of feeling in the room too, and that is, do you have hope for a resolution for this conflict? And if so, how do you imagine it?
It is hard. It is hard to have hope when we have seen what we have seen, an endless stream of death and destruction for 13 months. But if there's one thing that I've known through my life, you have to have hope. It's easy to fall into despair, but what good comes from that? And so, of course, after losing my grandmother and then my mother, you feel that perhaps there is no hope. But I think it is important to believe and important to ensure that people across industries are demanding more from our leaders and demanding that all lives are protected, and that that requires a collective effort of people across industries, including the media.
This question is about the Australian government. It enforces boycotts and sanctions on many regimes, including Syria, Yemen, Iran, and so on. And often they do that on the basis of human rights abuses. Given the credible accusations of genocide in Gaza, shouldn't similar sanctions be imposed on Israel?
I think that whoever wrote that question should ask the Prime Minister. That is a question that every journalist should be asking of our political leaders at the moment. I'm sometimes left completely stunned when I tune into political press conferences with our leaders and when I've tuned into those press conferences over the last 13 months, to see an entire press conference go without a question on Israel, without a question on Palestine or Gaza. How can that be? How can we say that we are being objective in our reporting if a dozen journalists can stand in front of the Prime Minister with the news that we've seen some mornings and not think to ask a question, or if they do, perhaps only one gets asked and then they move on? I think that is a question that we should all be expecting members of our press to be asking.
And perhaps finally, this question is about you mentioned the Israel lobby in relation to the media. Why is it that the Israel lobby is as powerful and effective, successful as it is?
That is a good question. I think the answer to it predates my time entering journalism. I think when you give ground, it becomes hard to then push back. And unfortunately, it seems that that is what newsrooms have done in the past. And that has weakened our journalism, and it has made it incredibly stifling. From my own experiences, I know how difficult it can sometimes be to get a story up simply because someone, whilst they acknowledge it to be a story, knows that it's going to be controversial and that puts an end to it. And so I don't know how you remedy that beyond empowering your journalists to pursue truth, to follow the weight of evidence. And that has to come across the board, across organisations, of course. But unfortunately, we see that it's not simply the lobby. We see it in media, inside media organisations themselves, who are willfully doing the work of the lobby themselves by smearing journalists, for example, or smearing those who support the Palestinian cause or speak out about the plight of the Palestinian people.
It seems like a silly question, but are there some media outlets or organisations that are worse than others?
I knew you would ask that question, so I have a very diplomatic answer. Andrew, I very deliberately decided not to make this speech about any one particular organisation. Of course, my reflections, because I have been at the ABC for most of my career, will inevitably be about my experiences there. But these failures exist across the board. No one particular institution is entirely immune. But yes, some do it better than others. And I've been heartened by some of the editorial pieces and reporting that has been published by The Guardian. In particular, the editorial piece that called out the mass attack across Lebanon, where Israel detonated thousands of bombs. And The Guardian took a position on that and said that it shouldn't have been allowed to happen and that was illegal. And so that's, yeah, there are some doing it better than others. I think everyone needs to reflect, though.
Nour, what can I say except thank you?
Thank you, Andrew.
Obviously, we couldn't get to everyone's question, and I'm sorry for those we missed, but thank you for participating in those questions. I think you've asked some really pertinent and interesting ones. Let me thank a few people quickly who've been instrumental to make this happen this evening. Olivia Hutchison, Keir Semenov, Caroline James-Garrod, Ellie Clay, Maria Teresa, Tavares Costa, and Coco Veldkamp. And thank you to the Dean, to Jennifer Balint, and of course, to this year's A.N. Smith lecturer, Nour Haydar. Thank you very much.